Chapter 5. Private Gerald of the Black Badger Company was working on a pair of dice. He'd finished the first one, and he was almost done with the second. He was filing off 2 of the sharp corners on the die, rounding them slightly so that they would tend to roll to a pre-selected point, showing a score of 6 more often than sheer chance would allow. It wasn't as reliable as his alternative method of fixing a pair of dice. That involved carefully inserting weights to make it fall with the selected side face up. But sanding the corners increased his chance of a winning roll. In his pocket, he had a pair of counterweighted dice, carefully doctored to show scores of 1 and 2. But weighting dice was a tricky business. It took a long time to remove all signs that something had been inserted in the little cubes. His other pair had been confiscated some days previously by a passing officer. Now he had to resort to rounding the corners to replace them. You needed 2 pairs of doctored dice to fleece a new victim. You used 1 pair to get him interested, letting him win the first few rolls. Then, when he thought his luck was in, you suggested raising the stakes. And when he agreed, you switched the dice so he'd roll a losing number. A shadow fell across the entrance to the tent, and Gerald hastily shoved the die and the small file under a blanket. The entrance to the tent was blocked for a moment as a man entered. Gerald looked up, frowning. The newcomer carried a kit bag and a sheathed sword and sword belt. He was wearing a soldier's uniform with a black badger on the left breast. He looked around the interior of the tent, saw an empty bunk, and dropped his belongings onto it. "Who the devil are you?" Cord asked. He'd been lying back on his own bunk on the opposite side of the tent, and the displeasure was obvious in his voice. He and Gerald had enjoyed having the tent to themselves. Their tent mates had been killed or wounded in the battle. Now, it seemed, they had a new man joining them. "Name's Arate," the newcomer said. "I've been transferred from the 2nd squad. Sergeant Major said for me to bunk in here." He was a short man, slightly built but with powerful shoulders and a deep chest. His beard and hair were ragged and unkempt. He had a grubby bandage wound round his head. Above it, the hair was black and the eyes were dark and piercing. Like a bird of prey, Gerald thought. Then he smirked at the idea. It was more likely that the stranger would become prey for him and Cord, once he had a chance to finish working on that pair of dice. Even so, he didn't want the stranger in the tent with them. "Find somewhere else to bunk," he said shortly. "We're full here." "There's only 2 of you," Arate said reasonably, looking around the tent. "You heard him," Cord said. "Now get out of here." Arate shrugged. "If you say so." "I do, so get out." Shrugging, the newcomer picked up his kit and left the tent. Gerald smiled at Cord. That had been easy, he thought. Then his face darkened as he heard a loud voice outside the tent. "You there, Atare or whatever you call yourself. Where do you think you're going? I told you to bunk in tent 43, didn't I?" "The tent's full, Sergeant Major," Arate replied. "The blazes it is!" Cord and Gerald exchanged exasperated glances as they heard heavy footsteps approaching. Then the tent flap was thrown back and the bulky frame of Sergeant Major Griff filled the entrance. "My auntie's mustache, it's full! Get in here!" He glared at the 2 occupants. "You 2, make room!" he bellowed. "Yes, Sergeant Major," Gerald said sullenly. Cord managed a grunt in reply. As Arate re-entered the tent, Griff stepped in front of him to bar his way, his hands on his hips in an aggressive posture. "As for you, Ratty, you can report to the cookhouse and scrub rubbish bins and cookpots for the rest of the day. That might remind you next time to do as I tell you." "Yes, Sergeant Major," the small man said. His eyes were down, not meeting the temporary commanders. But as Griff stalked out of the room, he made an insulting gesture towards his back. Then he turned, shrugging, to Gerald and Cord. "Sorry about that," he said. Gerald and Cord exchanged a look. Then Gerald stood and took Arate's pack, placing it on an empty bunk. "Can't be helped. Griff can be a real pain. Better get along to the cookhouse or he'll be at you again." He caught Cord's eye. As soon as Arate had gone, they'd go through his kit to see if there was anything worth stealing. Cord nodded unobtrusively. The same thought was going through his mind. Arate sighed and turned to go. As he reached the entrance, Cord called after him. "When you've finished your work detail, maybe you'd like a little game of dice." Arate smiled at them. "That sounds like fun," he said. Cord threw up his hands in mock exasperation. "Another winning throw! Where does your luck come from, Arate?" The small trooper grinned happily as he raked in his earnings. He'd thrown 3 winning scores in a row, and now there was a respectable pile of coins on the low table where the 3 of them were seated. "Just my lucky day, I suppose," he said, pushing forward a new wager and shaking the dice in their cup. The bone cubes rattled together, then he cast them onto the table. "Double 6 again," Gerald said. "I don't believe it." He looked at Cord. "I think we've got a professional in the tent." Cord nodded gloomily, but Arate merely laughed. "Not me, boys. It's just clean living and a clear conscience. Want to raise the stakes?" He said it casually, but he noticed the quick, furtive look that passed between the 2 men. Cord agreed, after a brief show of reluctance. "Well, I might be crazy, but why not? It'll give us a chance to win some of our money back." "Or I'll clean you out sooner," smiled Arate. He put another bet forward, waited till they matched it, then rolled again. 11 this time, but still an automatic winner. "Can't you roll anything but 5s and 6s?" Gerald said. "Not when I'm running hot," Arate smiled. But his eyes narrowed as this time, instead of letting him reclaim the dice, Cord picked them up and handed them to him. "He's made the switch," Holt thought. He took the dice, placed them in the cup, shook them, and rolled. The other 2 gave an ironic cheer as the dice turned face up to show a 2 and a 1. "3!" said Gerald, "and about time." It was a simple game. 11 and 12 were automatic winners. 2 and 3 were losers. Any other score didn't count. The gambler simply threw again until he won or lost. Holt grimaced as the others scooped in the money he'd bet. The dice passed to Gerald and he threw a 6, then a 4, then a 2. Holt won back a small fraction of what he had lost on his last throw. Cord took the dice and fumbled as he placed them in the cup. He switched them again, Holt thought, and sure enough, Cord threw an 11, then a 12, winning 2 small hands, before switching the dice once more and losing. In the process of handing the dice on to Holt, he switched them yet again for the winning set. The 2 cheats didn't want Arate, as they thought he was called, losing enthusiasm too soon. The game went on, Holt winning some hands, losing others, but generally staying just ahead of breaking even. The 2 cheats kept plying him with wine, which he surreptitiously managed to empty into an old boot when they weren't watching. But he pretended to become more and more affected by the drink, slurring his words and laughing foolishly when he won. "Big day tomorrow," he said, after they had been playing for some time. "We're moving out early and heading south." His 2 companions reacted with surprise at that. "South?" said Cord. "Why south? We're supposed to head home and disband." Holt shook his head and peered at them owlishly. "Not any more, not any more," he said, tapping the side of his nose with his forefinger. The Wargals are putting up a stiffer resistance than expected. Morgorath has them under firm control again, and Duncan needs extra men. We're them," he added after a pause. He could see that this news had the effect he'd desired. Cord and Gerald exchanged a glance. Then Gerald questioned him further. "Where'd you hear this?" he asked. Holt jerked a thumb over his shoulder in the general direction of the administration section of the camp. "At the cookhouse," he said. "The cooks had taken delivery of extra rations to prepare for us." Now the two cheats looked thoroughly concerned. Cookhouse rumors were the source of much intelligence among the rank and file, and they had a reputation for accuracy. Holt, of course, had heard no such rumors, but he hoped that the thought of an imminent departure for the south might force Cord and Gerald's hand. If they were planning to rob Daniel's farm, this might precipitate things. He leaned forward, peering with bleary eyes at the table. "Now, where are those dice?" he asked. "It's my throw again." "Here you are," Cord said, passing him the dice and throwing cup. He had just lost the last throw, and it was Holt's turn again. Holt was reasonably sure that he'd been handed the losing dice. His suspicions were confirmed by Gerald's next words. "It's getting late," he said. "Let's put it all on one last big pot. What do you say?" Cord pretended to look doubtful. "It's up to Arate." Holt shrugged. "Why not?" he said. "I feel my luck's coming back." They all shoved their remaining money into the center of the table. Holt reached for his tankard and took a deep swig, the biggest he'd had all night. Then, as he clumsily set the tankard down, he spilt the remaining wine on the table, flicking it towards Gerald so that a red tide flowed across the rough wood and into his lap. Gerald sprang backwards with a curse. "Look out!" he said. Sorry," Holt replied thickly. But in the confusion, he'd switched the losing dice for another pair that he had in his jerkin pocket. He'd prepared them that afternoon while he was supposed to be at the cookhouse, and they were shaved so that they would show a 12 at each throw. He shook them, muttering to them as he did so, then spilled them out onto the table. "Bad luck," began Cord, already reaching for the money. Then he stopped as he saw 2 sixes gleaming up at him, like 2 sets of teeth in 2 tiny skulls. "How did you—" Gerald stopped as he realized he'd give the game away if he went any further. Arate might be drunk, but he wasn't that drunk. Holt grinned foolishly at the dice and scooped them up. "Lucky dice," he said. "I love these dice." He pretended to kiss them noisily and switched them once more for the losing pair he'd been handed originally. That done, he slipped his own dice into his pocket and dropped the others back onto the table as he began to rake in his winnings. "No hard feelings, boys," he said. "I'll give you a chance for revenge tomorrow." "Yes, of course, tomorrow," Cord said. But his tone told Holt there would be no game the next night, and there'd be no sign of Cord or Gerald either. Half an hour later, Holt lay on his back, breathing heavily and noisily through his mouth as he feigned sleep. His 2 tent mates were talking in lowered voices. They had waited until they were sure Holt was fully asleep. Cord was testing the dice, rolling them over and over again, and constantly getting a losing score as a result. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "It's simply not possible for him to roll a 12 with these dice." "Careful," Gerald told him, casting a quick glance in Holt's direction. But his companion waved his caution aside. He's out like a light," he said. "Did you see how much he drank? He's as full as a boot." Holt's mouth twitched slightly in amusement. There was definitely a full boot in the tent, he thought. His loud breathing was making it difficult to hear what the others were saying, so he stirred, muttered something, and rolled onto his side, facing away from them. The snoring stopped as he was no longer on his back, but he kept his breathing deep and even. Cord and Gerald hesitated as he stirred, but soon relaxed when it became obvious he hadn't woken. Once again, Cord tested the dice. Once again, they rolled a 3. "Give it away," Gerald told him angrily. "It was an accident. They must have hit a crack or a dent in the tabletop. Besides, we've got more important things to think about." Reluctantly, Cord stowed the dice away in his pocket. "You mean this rumor about us heading south?" Gerald nodded. "Last thing we want is to get tied up in another campaign. It could go on for weeks, and we've got places to be. If we're held up, there's a chance that family members will arrive to help the widows, and we'll miss our chance." Turned away from them as he was, Holt could allow himself a scowl of anger. It was true, he thought. The two of them were planning to rob the families of men killed in the battle. "So, what's your plan?" Cord asked. Gerald paused, then came to a decision. "I say we pull out tonight. We'll leave an hour or two before dawn and get on the road north. We'll hit the sergeant's farm first. That's the closest." "We'll be flogged if they catch us deserting," Cord said, but Gerald dismissed the protest. "They won't catch us. With all the recent losses, odds are they won't even be sure we're gone." "Griff'll know. I get a feeling he has his eye on us." Cord snorted derisively. "Griff will be too busy doing his job and the captain's job to worry about us. He'll probably think it's good riddance. Now, let's turn in. We'll need to get started early." "What about him?" Gerald asked, jerking a thumb towards Holt's still figure. Cord hesitated. "I'd like to knock him on the head and take our money back," he said. "But if we kill him, Griff will have to take notice of the fact. He'd be sure to send men after us. Best if we leave him."